The laughter started the moment Noah Reed raised his bidder card. Men near the auction fence turned to look at him. A few shook their heads. One man covered his mouth, trying not to laugh too loudly. At the end of the machinery row sat an old blue diesel tractor. Its paint had faded to gray. Rust covered the hood. The seat was split open, one headlight was missing, and weeds had grown through the rear hitch. A cardboard sign hung from the steering wheel, "Does not run. Sold as is." Hal Turner, the auctioneer, lifted his microphone. $100 from the young man. Do I hear 125? No one answered. Mason Briggs, owner of the largest equipment dealership in town, stood beside the tractor with his arms crossed. "Engine's probably seized," he said. "If it isn't, the fuel pump is gone. That machine is scrap." The crowd laughed again. Noah kept his eyes on the tractor. He had inspected it before the auction began. The exhaust cap was still in place, which meant rain might not have entered the cylinders. The engine oil was black but not milky. The engine fan had moved slightly when he pulled the belt. That did not prove the tractor was good. It only proved Mason had spoken too soon. $100 going once, Hal called. A second bidder raised his card. It was Clyde Benson, owner of the local scrapyard. $125. Noah raised his card. $150. Clyde looked back at him and smiled. $175. $200, Noah said. His mother Ruth touched his arm. Noah. He knew what she meant. The money in his pocket was supposed to help repair the barn roof and buy feed if winter came early. But their own tractor had broken down 3 days before the hay harvest. Without another machine, they could lose the crop. Without the hay, they might have to sell half their cattle. Clyde raised the price again. $225, Noah answered. $250. The laughter faded. Mason stepped closer. You know what parts cost for a tractor that old? Noah ignored him. Clyde bid $300. Noah looked at the tractor one more time. He saw rust, cracked rubber, and years of neglect. But he also saw an engine that could still turn. $350, he said. Clyde studied the machine, calculated its scrap value, then lowered his card. Hal raised the wooden gavel. $350, going once. Noah's heart pounded. Going twice. His mother said nothing. Sold. The gavel struck. A few people clapped, but not to congratulate him. Mason smiled. Next time we see that tractor, it'll be on a scrap truck. Noah signed the sale paper and handed over the money. There were no refunds, no guarantees, only a rusted tractor and a decision he could no longer undo. Ruth walked with him to the machine. What now? She asked. Noah placed his hand on the cold engine block. Now we find out why it stopped running. A drop of dark fuel fell from the bottom of the filter and landed in the dirt. Noah watched it. The crowd saw a dead tractor. He saw a machine that had never been properly diagnosed. 3 days earlier, Noah had been cutting hay in the south field when the family tractor stopped moving. The engine still ran, but the wheels would not pull. He shut it down, climbed beneath the transmission, and found broken metal in the oil. The repair would cost more than the tractor was worth. By evening, dark clouds were forming beyond the hills. The forecast called for rain within a week. If the hay stayed standing, it would become coarse and lose much of its value. If Noah cut it without a working tractor to rake and bale it, the crop could rot in the field. His mother stood beside the broken machine. "How much hay do we have left from last winter?" Noah asked. Not enough. They both knew what that meant. The Reed farm had 23 cattle. Without the new hay crop, they would have to buy feed at winter prices or sell part of the herd. They could afford neither. Noah looked across the field his father had planted years before. The farm had never made them rich, but it had kept the family together. After his father died, Noah and Ruth had managed it alone. Barely. That night, Noah spread their bills across the kitchen table. Barn roof repairs, veterinary costs, fuel, property taxes. There was no money for another tractor. Then he saw the auction notice. Farm estate liquidation. Tractors, tools, and equipment. One photograph showed the old blue tractor at the end of a machinery row. The listing contained only 4 words. Diesel tractor. Does not run. Ruth read it over his shoulder. That could be worse than ours. It could. And if it is, Noah folded the notice. Then we lose the money. Ruth looked toward the dark window. And if we do nothing? Noah did not answer. They both knew. The rain would come. the hay would be lost, and by winter the herd might be gone. The auction was not a good opportunity. It was simply the only one they had. Noah arrived before most of the bidders. The auction yard was still quiet. Dew clung to the grass, and the old blue tractor sat at the end of the machinery row beneath a thin layer of dust. He walked around it once before touching anything. The rear tires were cracked, but they still held air. The hood was rusted, yet it sat straight on the frame. There were no fresh tool marks around the engine, which suggested no one had recently taken it apart and failed to put it back together. Noah lifted the hood. The smell of old diesel and dried oil rose from the engine compartment. He started with the block. No visible cracks, no broken casting, no sign that the engine had thrown a rod through the side. That did not mean the tractor was healthy, but it ruled out the worst damage he could see from the outside. Next, he pulled the dipstick. The oil was thick and black. It had clearly been there too long, but it was not gray or milky. If coolant or rainwater had mixed with the oil, it would have looked cloudy. The clean separation told Noah the inside of the engine might still be dry. He wiped the dipstick, pushed it back in, and checked again. The level was low but not empty. Then he moved to the fan belt. He wrapped both hands around it and pulled carefully. At first, nothing happened. He changed his grip and pulled again. The fan moved a fraction of an inch. Noah stopped. He tried once more. The fan shifted again, and the crankshaft moved with it. The engine was stiff, but it was not completely seized. That was the first real sign. He stepped back and looked at the exhaust pipe. The metal rain cap was still attached at the top. It was rusty and slightly bent, but it still covered the opening. If the pipe had been left open, rain could have run into the cylinders and rusted the engine from the inside. The cap did not guarantee that had never happened. It only made it less likely. Noah moved to the battery tray. The battery was missing, but the cables were still there. Both ends were covered in white and green corrosion. The ground strap was nearly hidden beneath dirt, rust, and old paint. A poor ground could make a starter turn too slowly, or not turn at all. Many people heard a slow starter and assumed the engine was locked. Noah followed the cable to the frame. The connection looked worse than the cable itself. He made a mental note. Then he checked the fuel system. The sediment bowl beneath the tank was almost black. A thick layer of sludge sat at the bottom, and the fuel inside looked darker than fresh diesel should. The filter housing was stained with old leaks. Noah loosened the drain plug slightly. A single drop formed beneath it. The liquid was dark and thick. Old fuel, dirt, and water could block the line before diesel ever reached the injectors. Again, that was not proof the engine would run, but it was a reason why it might not start. "You planning to repair it with your eyes?" Noah looked up. Mason Briggs stood on the other side of the tractor. His arms were crossed over the logo on his dealership jacket. "I'm checking it," Noah said. Mason smiled. "I checked it yesterday. Did you turn the engine by hand?" "It didn't start." "That isn't the same thing." Mason's smile tightened. Noah pointed toward the fuel filter. "Did you check whether fuel was reaching the pump? It's been sitting for years. Did you test compression?" Mason glanced toward the gathering crowd. "No need." "Why?" "Because it's an old machine that doesn't run." Noah wiped his hands on a rag. "That still isn't an answer." For a moment, Mason said nothing. Then he stepped closer. "You think you found something everyone else missed?" "No." Noah closed the hood. "I think everyone else stopped looking too soon." Mason gave a short laugh. "You buy it, you own the mistake." He turned and walked toward the auction tent. Noah stayed beside the tractor. He looked at the corroded cables, the dirty filter, and the rain cap above the exhaust. None of those details promised success. The engine could still have low compression. The injection pump could be damaged. The head gasket could be weak. The transmission and hydraulics could be useless. But the crowd had already decided the machine was dead. Noah had found no proof of that. Only neglect. And neglect could sometimes be repaired. By the time the blue tractor came up for sale, the auction yard was crowded. Farmers stood in small groups beside the machinery row. Dealers studied serial plates and tires. Scrap buyers waited near the back, looking for equipment cheap enough to break apart and resell. The tractor was pulled into the open by a larger machine. Its rear wheels rolled unevenly, and a rusty chain dragged beneath the hitch. When it stopped in front of the crowd, Hal Turner climbed onto his wooden platform and raised the microphone. "Next lot is the old diesel tractor at the end of the row." He glanced at the paper in his hand. "Unknown hours, unknown mechanical condition. It does not start and will be sold exactly as it sits." A worker lifted the cardboard sign so everyone could see it. "Does not run. Sold as is." Hal opened the bidding at $500. No one moved. He lowered it to $400. Still nothing. $300? A man near the fence laughed. "You'll have to pay us to haul it away." More laughter followed. Hal smiled, but his eyes stayed on the crowd. $200. Surely somebody needs parts. Clyde Benson raised 2 fingers. "I'll give 100. Hal pointed toward him. 100 from the scrapyard. "Do I hear 125? Noah raised his bidder card. 125. Several heads turned. Clyde looked over his shoulder and saw Noah standing beside Ruth. His expression changed from surprise to amusement. 150, Clyde said. Noah raised the card again. 175. The auctioneer's voice became faster. 175 from the young man. 200? Clyde lifted his hand. 200. Noah answered immediately. 225. This time, the crowd laughed openly. A man in a brown coat called out, "Let the boy have his lawn ornament." Noah kept his eyes on Hal. Ruth leaned closer. "You already decided your limit?" Noah nodded. But he had not told her the number. He had $860 in his pocket. Some of it belonged to the farm. The rest was money he had earned repairing fences and cleaning barns. He could not spend all of it. Even if the tractor ran, it would need oil, filters, hoses, and probably a battery. If it did not run, every dollar above scrap value would be lost. Clyde raised the bid to 250. Noah waited. The crowd went quiet for a moment. He looked at the tractor and repeated the facts in his mind. The engine could turn. The oil showed no obvious water contamination. The exhaust had remained covered. The electrical connections were badly corroded. The fuel system was full of sludge. Those signs suggested neglect, not proof of a destroyed engine. But suggestion was not certainty. Noah raised his card. 275. Clyde answered with 300. Mason Briggs stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. "Young man," he said, "you should think about what you're doing." Noah looked at him. "I am. That engine may need a complete rebuild. It may. The injection pump alone could cost more than the tractor." "I know." Mason shook his head. "No, you don't. Not until you've paid for the mistake." A few men murmured in agreement. Hal lifted the microphone. "I have 300. Do I hear 325? Noah raised his card. 325. Clyde looked at the tractor again. He was not bidding on hope. He was calculating steel, tires, radiator metal, and usable parts. The higher the price climbed, the less profit remained for him. He raised one finger. 350. Noah's stomach tightened. That was the number he had set before the bidding started. He could stop now and keep the money. The barn roof would still be repaired. They could buy several loads of hay. It would not be enough for the whole winter, but it would give them time. He looked at Ruth. She did not tell him to stop. She did not tell him to continue. "This has to be your decision," she said quietly. Noah looked toward the south, beyond the auction buildings. Dark clouds were gathering over the hills. The same weather system was moving toward their hayfield. Without a tractor, they would lose more than the money in his pocket. Hal called again. 350. Looking for 375. Noah lifted the card. 375. The laughter stopped. Clyde stared at him. For the first time, he no longer looked amused. He walked toward the tractor and inspected the rear tires. Then he examined the radiator and the cast iron housing near the transmission. He was deciding whether the machine was still worth buying for parts. Hal waited. 400, Clyde? Clyde rubbed his chin. Then he lowered his hand. "I'm out." Hal turned toward the rest of the crowd. "I have $375. Anyone at 400? No one moved. Mason looked around as if expecting another dealer to intervene. No one did. Hal raised the wooden gavel. 375 going once. Noah felt every eye in the yard on him, going twice. For a second he wanted someone else to bid. It would end the risk. He could walk away and tell himself the price had simply gone too high. No card was raised. Sold. The gavel struck the platform. The sound was sharp and final. A few people clapped. Others laughed again, but more quietly now. Noah lowered his bidder card. His hand had begun to shake. Mason walked past him. "Congratulations," he said. "You just bought the most expensive piece of scrap in the yard." Noah did not answer. Inside the auction office, a clerk placed a form in front of him. The paper listed every warning. Unknown condition. No guarantee. No return. Buyer accepts all risk. Noah signed his name and counted out the money. When the clerk stamped the receipt, $375 stopped being savings and became a rusted machine that could not move under its own power. Outside, Ruth waited beside the tractor. She looked at the cracked seat, faded paint, and blackened fuel filter. "Do you still think you saw something?" she asked. Noah placed one hand on the hood. "I saw reasons not to give up on it." "That isn't the same as knowing it will run." "No." He looked toward the engine. "It's enough to start." Behind them, the auctioneer introduced the next lot, and the crowd moved on. Within minutes, no one was looking at Noah or the tractor anymore, but as Noah crouched near the fuel filter, a dark drop formed beneath the drain plug and fell into the dirt. Then another followed. He touched it with one finger. The fuel smelled old and looked almost black. The tractor had not told him why it was silent, but it had just given him his first place to look. It took most of the afternoon to get the tractor home. Earl Dawson, an older farmer from 2 roads over, agreed to haul it on his flatbed trailer. The blue tractor looked smaller once it was parked beside the Reed barn, but the problems looked worse. Rust covered the fuel lines. The wiring was brittle. One rear tire had a slow leak. Ruth stood near the barn door while Noah unloaded a box of tools. "Where do you begin?" she asked. "Before I try to start it, I make sure starting it won't destroy it." Noah removed the battery cables first. The old ground strap was badly corroded where it connected to the frame. He cleaned the metal with a wire brush until the surface shone, then tightened the connection. Next, he drained the fuel tank. The diesel came out dark brown. The first few cups carried water and thick black sediment. Noah caught the liquid in a clear jar and held it toward the light. A layer of water settled at the bottom. Ruth looked at it. Could that be the whole problem? Maybe part of it. Noah removed the sediment bowl and cleaned out the sludge. Then he replaced the fuel filter with one he had found at a farm supply store. It was one of the few parts he could afford without knowing whether the engine was worth saving. He checked the engine oil again. The level was low, so he drained it completely. No large metal pieces came out with it. That was a good sign, but he knew fine damage would not always be visible. He installed a new filter and added fresh oil. Then he removed the spark-like glow plugs used to help the diesel start in cold conditions. With the compression released, he turned the engine slowly by hand. The crankshaft moved through a full rotation, then another. It was stiff in places, but it did not lock. Noah allowed himself a small breath of relief. The engine was not seized. That did not mean it had enough compression to run, but at least the internal parts could move. By sunset, he had cleaned the battery tray, repaired one cracked wire, and filled the tank with fresh diesel. Earl returned with a used battery. "It's not new," he said, setting it beside the tractor, "but it held a charge in my old truck." Noah thanked him and connected it. The work light above the barn door cast long shadows across the engine. Ruth brought Noah a sandwich, but he left it untouched on the workbench. He opened the fuel valve. Fresh diesel moved into the sediment bowl. For a few seconds, everything looked clean. Then a small air bubble appeared in the line. Noah watched it rise. He loosened the bleed screw on the fuel filter until diesel began to leak out. When the flow looked steady, he tightened it again. He climbed into the seat. The cracked cushion shifted beneath him. Earl stood near the front wheel. "Transmission in neutral?" Noah checked twice. "Neutral. Oil pressure gauge connected?" "Yes." "Fire extinguisher?" Ruth pointed to it beside the barn door. Noah rested one hand on the starter switch. For the first time since the auction, the decision felt real. Until now, the tractor had only been a problem to study. The moment he pressed the switch, it would either respond or expose how much more was wrong. He turned the key. The starter clicked once. Nothing else happened. Noah released the key. Earl looked toward the battery. "Try again." Noah pressed the switch a second time. The starter engaged. The engine turned slowly, one rotation, then another. A weak cloud of white smoke rose from the exhaust. Noah's eyes lifted toward it. Fuel was reaching at least part of the engine. He held the starter for several more seconds. The engine coughed once. A deep, uneven sound came from inside the block. Then it stopped. Noah released the key before the starter overheated. For a moment no one spoke. "That was something," Ruth said. Noah climbed down and placed his hand near the starter motor. It was already warm. Not enough. He checked the battery terminals. Both were tight. He tried again after a short rest. This time the engine turned faster. White smoke came from the exhaust in short bursts. It coughed twice. For half a second, one cylinder seemed to fire. Then the starter slowed and the engine fell silent. Noah sat motionless in the seat. Earl walked around the tractor. "It wants to start, or it wants us to think it does." Earl smiled slightly. "Machines don't lie that well." Noah climbed down and opened the hood. Fresh fuel had reached the filter, but he could still see bubbles moving through the clear section of the line. He checked the fittings one by one. One connection near the injection pump was damp. He tightened it. Then he tried again. The engine turned, coughed, smoked, stopped. The battery weakened with every attempt. When the starter finally clicked without turning, Noah shut off the key. The barn became quiet again. Only the ticking of cooling metal remained. Ruth picked up the sandwich from the workbench and handed it to him. "You did more than anyone at the auction did. It still doesn't run." "No." She looked at the tractor. "But it turned. It made smoke. It tried." Noah stared at the dark exhaust pipe. At the auction, he had believed the problem might be simple. Dirty fuel, corroded cables, a neglected battery. He had corrected all three. The tractor was still silent. For the first time, he wondered whether Mason Briggs had been right. Maybe the injection pump was damaged. Maybe the compression was too low. Maybe the engine was worn beyond anything Noah could afford to repair. He looked at the money left in the envelope. Not enough for a rebuild. Not enough for another tractor. Outside the barn, wind moved through the field. The tall hay bent in the darkness. The rain was getting closer. Noah turned back toward the engine. White smoke meant fuel was entering the cylinders. The engine could turn. It had even fired once. The tractor was not dead, but something was still keeping it from staying alive. Noah stayed in the barn after Ruth and Earl went inside. The battery was nearly dead. The engine was cold again. A thin smell of diesel hung in the air. He replayed every step: fresh fuel, clean filter, new oil, better electrical connection. The engine turned, produced white smoke, and fired once. That meant fuel was entering the cylinders, but not correctly or not consistently. Noah opened the toolbox that had belonged to his grandfather. At the bottom, beneath old sockets and bent wrenches, was a small notebook with a cracked leather cover. His grandfather had filled it with repair notes. Some pages listed part numbers. Others contained rough diagrams of pumps, valves, and wiring. The handwriting was uneven and faded. Noah turned through the pages until he found a section marked "Old Diesels, Hard Starting." One sentence had been underlined twice. A diesel needs clean air, clean fuel, compression, and correct timing. Check them in that order. Noah read it again. He had focused on the battery and the fuel tank. He had not checked the air intake. He lifted the hood and removed the intake hose. Inside the air cleaner housing, he found a dense nest of dried grass, dust, and seed husks. Mice had packed the passage almost completely shut. The engine had been trying to start without enough air. Noah cleaned the housing and washed the oil bath filter. By the time he reassembled it, his hands were black with dirt. Then he returned to the fuel system. The bubbles in the line bothered him. A diesel injection pump could not compress air the way it compressed fuel. Even a small pocket of air could interrupt the pressure needed to open the injectors. Noah loosened the bleed screw on the filter again. Fuel came out, but not in a steady stream. It stopped, then flowed, then stopped again. He traced the line back toward the tank and found a small crack near a fitting. It was not leaking much fuel, but it could pull air into the system when the pump created suction. He cut away the damaged section and installed a temporary replacement hose. After tightening the clamps, he opened the fuel valve. This time, diesel flowed steadily. Noah bled the filter until no bubbles appeared. Then he moved to the injection pump. He loosened the first bleed screw and worked the manual lever. Air hissed out, then foamy fuel. Finally, a clean stream. He repeated the process at the second screw. The notebook gave one final instruction. If air remains, bleed at the injector lines. Noah loosened the metal line at the first injector, then the second, then the third and fourth. Earl returned carrying a charger. "You're still at it? I found air in the pump. That could do it," and the intake was blocked. Earl looked into the pile of mouse nesting on the floor. That would do it too. They connected the charger and waited until the battery had recovered enough strength. Noah climbed into the seat. He checked the gear lever. Neutral. Fuel valve open. Throttle slightly forward. He held the decompression lever, allowing the engine to turn with less resistance, then pressed the starter. The engine rotated faster than before. Fuel began to pulse from the loose injector lines. One line produced a solid stream. The second did the same. The third sputtered with air. Noah kept turning the engine until the bubbles disappeared. Then he tightened each fitting. "Now try it," Earl said. Noah released the decompression lever and pressed the starter again. The engine turned. A cloud of white smoke rose from the exhaust. It coughed once, then twice. For a second, the engine caught on two cylinders and shook the entire tractor. Noah released the starter. The engine stopped. But this time the sound had been stronger. He tried again. The engine fired repeatedly but still could not continue on its own. Earl listened closely. Fuel sounds better. Then what is missing? Maybe heat? Maybe compression? Maybe timing? Noah looked at the glow plug circuit. The wires were old, and one terminal was loose. He connected a test light. No power reached the plugs when he turned the key. Without preheating, a cold, worn diesel could struggle to ignite fuel, even if everything else worked. Noah cleaned the terminals and found a broken wire near the relay. He repaired it, then tested the circuit again. The light came on. He held the preheat switch for 20 seconds. A faint warmth reached the intake manifold. Then he pressed the starter. The engine turned faster. One cylinder fired. A second joined it. The tractor shook hard as dark smoke burst from the exhaust. For one brief moment the engine almost ran. Then it died. Noah sat still, listening to the starter spin down. He had solved 3 real problems: blocked air, air trapped in the fuel system, a failed preheat connection. Yet the tractor still refused to stay running. Earl placed a hand on the hood. "You're closer." Noah looked at the notebook. His grandfather's list had one item left: compression. That was the expensive answer. Low compression could mean worn rings, damaged valves, or an engine that needed to be rebuilt. Noah closed the notebook. He had wanted the problem to be dirt and bad wiring. Now he had reached the point where simple fixes ended. The tractor had spoken louder than before, but it still had not roared. The next morning, Noah found Earl standing beside the blue tractor with another man. He was thin, gray-haired, and walked with a wooden cane. "This is Walter Hale," Earl said. He knew the previous owner. Walter placed one hand on the tractor's fender. "Belonged to Ben Carver," he said. "Bought it used 20 years ago. Kept it running himself." Noah stepped closer. "When did it stop?" Walter looked toward the engine. "It didn't stop in the field. That's what everyone keeps getting wrong." "What happened?" "Ben got sick. The tractor sat in his shed for almost a year. After he died, his nephew dragged it outside and tried to start it with a weak battery." Noah listened carefully. "Did the engine turn?" "Slowly. Too slowly. They tried several times, then said it was seized." "It isn't seized." Walter nodded. "I didn't think so." He pointed toward the right side of the engine. "Ben had trouble with the starter circuit before. He carried a wrench because the ground cable would loosen." Noah looked at the cable he had cleaned. "I fixed the connection at the frame." Walter bent slightly and pointed deeper into the engine bay. "Not that one. The other end." The ground strap disappeared behind the battery tray and connected directly to the engine housing. Noah reached down and touched the bolt. It looked tight, but when he pulled the cable, the entire connection moved. He removed the bolt. Rust covered the threads. The metal surface beneath the cable terminal was coated with old paint, oil, and corrosion. The cable had been connected, but electricity had almost no clean path into the engine block. Earl looked at Noah. "That starter may be turning, but not at full speed. A diesel engine needed fast cranking to build enough compression heat to ignite fuel. If the starter turned too slowly, The engine could smoke, cough, and appear damaged even when the internal parts were still usable. Noah cleaned the terminal until bare metal appeared. Then he cleaned the bolt, the engine surface, and the cable end. He added a second ground cable from the battery directly to the starter housing. Walter watched him work. Ben always said that machine hated bad connections. Noah tightened the final bolt. Anything else I should know? Walter thought for a moment. The shutoff lever used to stick. Noah moved to the fuel control linkage. The lever appeared to move normally from the operator's seat, but the arm at the injection pump did not return fully. A layer of dried grease had hardened around the joint. When Noah pushed it by hand, it moved another half-inch. That could be holding the fuel partly closed, he said. He cleaned the linkage, worked it back and forth, then added fresh lubricant. The movement became smooth. Two faults had been hiding in plain sight. The starter had not been receiving full current. The injection pump may not have been opening completely. By noon, the battery was charged. Noah checked everything again. Fresh oil, clean fuel, clear air intake, bled injector lines, working glow plugs, clean ground connections, free fuel control linkage. Ruth stood near the barn door. Walter and Earl waited beside the front wheel. Noah climbed into the seat. He held the preheat switch for 20 seconds. Then he pressed the starter. The difference was immediate. The engine turned faster than it had the night before. White smoke rose from the exhaust. The tractor coughed once, then again. One cylinder fired hard enough to shake the hood. A second joined it. For 3 seconds the engine ran unevenly. Then it stopped. Noah released the starter. No one spoke. Walter smiled. "That engine isn't dead?" Noah looked at the exhaust pipe. A thin thread of smoke still drifted from the top. The tractor had run only for a few seconds, but it had run. Now the question was no longer whether the engine could start. The question was what was preventing it from staying alive. The tractor had run for 3 seconds. That was enough to prove the engine could fire, but not enough to explain why it kept dying. Noah climbed down and opened the hood. "Try it again," Earl said. "I'll watch the fuel." Noah returned to the seat, heated the glow plugs, and pressed the starter. The engine caught almost immediately. It shook hard, firing unevenly as white smoke rolled from the exhaust. For 2 seconds it sounded as if it might continue. Then the engine slowed and stopped. Earl pointed toward the sediment bowl. The fuel level dropped. Noah came down from the seat. The glass bowl beneath the tank was only half full. A thin stream of diesel entered from above, but it was not flowing fast enough to replace what the engine had used. They had cleaned the filter and bled the lines, yet something before the filter was still restricting the supply. Noah opened the fuel cap. A faint sucking sound came from the tank. Everyone heard it. "The vent is blocked," Earl said. A diesel tank needed air to enter as fuel left. If the vent in the cap was clogged, a vacuum could form inside the tank and slow the flow until the engine starved. Noah inspected the cap. Its tiny vent hole was packed with rust and hardened dirt. He pushed a thin wire through it, then blew compressed air across the passage until it opened. "That may not be the only blockage," he said. He closed the fuel valve and disconnected the line beneath the tank. Only a few drops came out. Noah opened the valve again. The flow remained weak. Walter leaned against his cane. Ben used to keep a small screen above that valve. Noah removed the fitting from the bottom of the tank. A narrow metal screen came out with it. It was almost completely covered in black sludge. The old fuel had broken down during the years the tractor sat unused. Rust, dirt, and biological growth had collected around the screen, allowing just enough diesel through to fill the filter slowly, but not enough to keep the engine running. Noah cleaned the screen in fresh diesel until light passed through the mesh. Then he flushed the tank outlet and reinstalled the fitting. When he opened the valve again, fuel rushed into the line. The sediment bowl filled in seconds. "That's the first healthy fuel flow we've seen," Earl said. Noah bled the system once more. At the filter, the diesel ran without bubbles. At the injection pump, the stream was clean. At each injector line, fuel appeared in steady pulses. By then, the afternoon sun had begun to fall behind the barn. The wind carried the smell of rain from the west. Noah checked the engine oil level, then the coolant. He placed the transmission in neutral and made sure the parking brake was set. Ruth moved the fire extinguisher closer. "You think this is it?" she asked. "I think it has everything it needs." "That isn't what I asked." Noah looked at the tractor. I don't know. He climbed into the cracked seat. His hands were black with diesel, rust, and grease. A cut across one knuckle had opened again, leaving a dark stain on the steering wheel. Earl stood near the engine, watching the oil pressure gauge through the side of the dash. Walter remained beside the barn. Ruth stood a few feet away, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Noah opened the throttle slightly. He held the preheat switch. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then he pressed the starter. The engine turned faster than it ever had before. A burst of white smoke escaped from the exhaust. One cylinder fired, then a second. The tractor shook violently. Noah kept the starter engaged for another moment. The third cylinder joined. A cloud of black smoke exploded from the exhaust as the engine caught. Noah released the starter. For half a second, the engine seemed ready to die again. Its speed dropped. The hood rattled. Then the fourth cylinder fired. The engine surged into a deep, uneven roar. Dust fell from the underside of the hood. The exhaust cap snapped open and closed with every pulse. Black smoke climbed above the barn before thinning into gray. The tractor was running. Ruth covered her mouth. Walter laughed. Earl raised one hand but kept his eyes on the gauge. Oil pressure! Noah looked down. The needle remained near zero. His excitement vanished. He reached for the shutoff lever. Then the needle moved. Slowly at first. It climbed into the operating range. Pressure's coming up, Earl called. Noah kept the engine at low speed. He listened for knocking, grinding, or any sharp metallic sound that might signal internal damage. The engine missed occasionally, but there was no heavy knock. No coolant poured from the block. No oil appeared beneath the tractor. After 30 seconds, the exhaust began to clear. The violent shaking softened into a steady diesel rhythm. Noah placed one hand on the steering wheel. At the auction, the tractor had seemed silent and lifeless. Now every loose panel vibrated. The floor trembled beneath his boots. Warm exhaust carried the smell of old oil and fresh diesel across the yard. Ruth stepped closer. You did it. Not yet. Noah watched the temperature gauge. A running engine was not the same as a working tractor. It could still overheat. The transmission could fail. The hydraulic pump might be ruined. But for the first time, the machine was able to reveal its problems instead of hiding them behind silence. Noah let it idle for several minutes. A small coolant leak appeared near the upper radiator hose. He shut the engine down immediately. The sudden silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a machine that could not run. It was the silence of a machine waiting to be repaired. Earl examined the hose. Dry rubber, he said. Easy replacement. Walter tapped the fender with his cane. Mason said the engine was dead. Noah looked at the black smoke still drifting above the barn. The engine was never the problem. The tractor had been starved by dirty fuel, trapped air, weak electrical connections, a blocked intake, and years of neglect. No single failure had killed it. Several small failures had hidden what remained alive underneath. Noah climbed down and rested his hand against the warm hood. For the first time since the auction, he smiled. The crowd had laughed because the tractor made no sound. Now, miles away from the auction yard, the old diesel had answered them. The tractor had started, but Noah knew better than to celebrate too soon. A machine that could idle in a barn was not necessarily ready to work in a field. He waited until the engine cooled, then replaced the cracked radiator hose. The old rubber broke apart in his hands as he removed it. He also changed the fan belt. It looked intact from a distance, but several deep cracks opened when he bent it. By the next morning, the cooling system was sealed and the engine held steady pressure. Noah started the tractor again. The diesel fired faster this time. The exhaust smoked for a few seconds, then cleared. He let it warm slowly while watching the gauges. Oil pressure remained stable. Temperature rose into the normal range. No strange knocking came from the engine. That was the good news. The bad news appeared when Noah pressed the clutch and shifted into first gear. The lever resisted. He pushed harder. The gears ground loudly. Noah immediately returned it to neutral. Earl, standing beside the tractor, looked toward the clutch housing. Clutch may be stuck. The tractor had sat unused for years. Moisture could cause the clutch disc to rust against the flywheel, preventing it from releasing even when the pedal was pressed. Noah shut the engine down. He checked the linkage first. The pedal moved, but the adjustment was badly out of position. He cleaned the joints, lubricated them, and corrected the free play. Then he started the tractor again. This time the transmission entered gear with less resistance. Noah slowly released the clutch. The tractor moved, only a few feet. Then the left rear wheel locked. The engine strained and nearly stalled. Noah pushed the clutch in and stopped. When he climbed down, he smelled hot metal near the wheel. The brake was dragging. He removed the inspection cover and found rust, dirt, and hardened grease around the mechanism. The brake lining had not released fully after years of sitting. It took most of the afternoon to free it. He cleaned the moving parts, adjusted the linkage, and tested the wheel by hand until it turned without resistance. The next problem was the hydraulic system. Noah connected the farm's old mower to the rear hitch and pulled the hydraulic lever. Nothing happened. The engine note changed slightly, but the lift arms did not move. He checked the fluid. The level was low, and what remained inside looked cloudy. Water had entered the system. Noah drained it. The first liquid that came out was thin and gray. Rust-colored water followed before the old hydraulic oil began to flow. Ruth watched from the doorway. "Can it still be saved?" "I won't know until it has clean fluid." Noah flushed the reservoir, replaced the filter screen, and filled the system again. When he pulled the control lever, the lift arms shook but stayed low. He tried a second time. They rose several inches, then stopped. Earl listened near the pump. "It's pulling air." Noah inspected the suction line and found a loose fitting beneath the housing. The seal had hardened and split. He replaced it with a spare gasket Earl had brought from his workshop. After bleeding the system, Noah pulled the lever again. The lift arms rose slowly. Then they reached full height. The mower hung behind the tractor. For the first time, the machine looked ready to work. Noah lowered the attachment and raised it again. The movement was still slower than it should have been, but it held the weight. He climbed into the seat and drove the tractor around the barn. First gear, second gear, reverse. The steering was heavy, and every panel rattled, but the machine moved under its own power. Then Noah pressed both brake pedals. The tractor pulled sharply to the right. He stopped before reaching the fence. The left brake now released, but it was not strong enough to stop evenly. Another adjustment. Another hour of work. By sunset, both brakes responded together. Noah drove the tractor into the yard one final time. He accelerated slightly, shifted up, then stopped in a straight line. Ruth stood near the barn with her arms folded. "Is it ready?" Noah looked toward the south field. The hay was still standing. The wind had grown stronger, and dark clouds were visible beyond the ridge. "It can move," he said. "That's not what I asked." Noah listened to the engine. The temperature was steady. The oil pressure was good. The hydraulics could lift the mower. The brakes worked. But every repair had revealed another failure. He knew the field would place more strain on the tractor than anything they had tested in the yard. "No," he said, "it isn't ready." Ruth looked at him. "Then what do we do?" Noah shifted into gear and turned the tractor toward the field. "We find out what breaks next." The old diesel moved away from the barn, pulling the mower behind it. Starting the engine had silenced the crowd. Now the tractor had to prove it could save the farm. Noah entered the south field just after sunrise. The hay stood nearly waist-high in places, pale green beneath a darkening sky. Wind moved across it in long waves. The rain was closer than the forecast had promised. He lowered the mower and eased the tractor forward. For the first 50 yards, everything worked. The engine held a steady rhythm. The mower cut cleanly, leaving a flat row behind him. Noah kept one eye on the temperature gauge and the other on the oil pressure needle. Both remained normal. Then the rear attachment dropped. The mower struck the ground and began dragging through the dirt. Noah pushed in the clutch and raised the hydraulic lever. The lift arms moved, but as soon as he released the control, they sank again. He shut down the engine. Ruth crossed the field carrying a toolbox. "What happened?" "The hydraulics won't hold pressure." They checked the hoses first. No leaks. The new fluid level was still correct. Noah removed the inspection cover and watched the linkage, while Ruth moved the control lever. The internal arm was not traveling far enough to hold the valve in position. Years of rust and wear had created too much play in the linkage. Noah tightened the adjustment as far as it would go, then added a temporary steel spacer to remove the remaining slack. It was not a permanent repair. It only needed to last through the field. He started the tractor again. The mower rose. This time it stayed up. They returned to work. Noah drove slowly at first, listening for changes in the engine. The old diesel pulled harder whenever the mower entered thick grass, but it did not overheat. By mid-morning, they had cut less than half the field. The wind became colder. Ruth looked toward the ridge. "We need to move faster. If I push it too hard, we may lose the tractor. If we don't, we lose the hay." Noah increased the throttle slightly. The mower began to cover more ground. Dust, grass seed, and pieces of dry stalk filled the air behind him. The tractor's faded hood vibrated under the load, but the engine continued to pull. Then the mower struck something hidden in the grass. A loud metallic crack came from behind the tractor. Noah stopped immediately. One cutting blade had hit an old fence post buried near the edge of the field. The impact had bent a guard and knocked the drive belt out of alignment. Ruth looked at the clouds. "How long?" "I don't know." They raised the mower and worked beside it in the grass. Noah loosened the damaged guard and hammered it straight against the tractor hitch. The belt had not broken, but one pulley had shifted. He realigned it with a wrench, tightened the mounting bolts, and turned the system by hand. Nothing caught. Nothing scraped. He climbed back into the seat. When the mower started again, the belt stayed in place. They continued cutting. By early afternoon, the field was down. But cutting the hay was only the first step. It still had to dry, be raked into rows, and baled before the rain arrived. The sun appeared for less than an hour, just enough to warm the cut grass. Noah used the tractor to pull the rake while Ruth checked the hay by hand. "It's still damp underneath," she said. "We don't have another day. Wet hay can heat inside the barn." "I know." Baling damp hay could cause mold or even create enough internal heat to start a fire. They could not simply rush it into storage. Noah adjusted the rake to turn the rows again, exposing the wet grass beneath. The tractor worked without stopping. By late afternoon, the hay had dried enough to bale safely. Earl arrived with an old square baler. "I heard thunder west of town," he said. Noah connected the baler to the tractor. "You think this machine can pull it?" Earl asked. "We're about to find out." The baler placed more strain on the tractor than the mower had. Every time the plunger compressed a new bale, the machine sent a hard pulse through the drawbar. The engine speed dropped, recovered, then dropped again. Noah watched the gauges. Temperature rising. Still safe. Oil pressure steady. He kept the tractor in low gear. The first bale came out loose. Earl stopped them and tightened the tension. The second bale held together, then the third. They worked across the field while the sky darkened above them. Ruth stacked the bales on a wagon. Earl tied the broken ones by hand. Noah kept driving. The tractor's exhaust grew darker under load, but it did not quit. Halfway through the final section, the engine suddenly lost power. Noah pushed in the clutch. The diesel continued running, but only at a rough idle. His stomach tightened. Not now. He opened the hood and checked the fuel bowl. Dark particles had begun collecting at the bottom again. The movement across the field had shaken more sediment loose inside the tank. Fuel flow was slowing. Noah shut the valve and removed the bowl. He cleaned the screen with diesel from a spare can while Ruth held a flashlight. Thunder sounded beyond the ridge. "Can we finish?" she asked. Noah reinstalled the bowl. "We have to." He bled the line quickly, returned to the seat, and started the engine. The diesel fired. Its speed steadied. They went back to work. The first drops of rain fell as the baler tied the final row. Not enough to soak the field. Not yet. Noah turned the tractor toward the barn with the loaded wagon behind him. The rear tires slipped once on the rising ground. He shifted into a lower gear and kept moving. More drops struck the hood. Ruth and Earl walked behind the wagon, checking the ropes that held the bales in place. The barn was less than a quarter-mile away. The rain began falling harder. Noah did not increase the speed. The wagon was heavy, the ground uneven, and one careless turn could overturn the entire load. He kept the tractor slow and straight. When the front wheels reached the barnyard, Ruth ran ahead and opened both doors. Noah backed the wagon inside. The final bale crossed the doorway just as the rain became a steady sheet. Water hammered the metal roof. For several seconds no one spoke. Noah shut down the tractor. The engine stopped with one final shudder. The silence inside the barn was filled by rain and the smell of fresh hay. Ruth looked at the stacked bales, enough to keep the cattle fed, enough to avoid selling the herd, enough to give the farm another winter. She turned toward Noah. "You saved it." He looked at the old tractor. Mud covered the tires. Grass clung to the axle. A thin line of diesel ran beneath the sediment bowl. The machine still needed work. The roof still needed repairs. The bills had not disappeared, but the crop was dry and under cover. "No," Noah said. "We finished in time." Outside, the storm covered the entire field they had just cleared. At the auction, the tractor had proved it could start. In the south field, it proved it could work, and that was the difference between winning an argument and saving a farm. 2 weeks later, Noah drove the blue tractor into town. He had not repainted it. The hood was still faded. Rust still marked the fenders. The seat was covered with a piece of heavy canvas, and one headlight remained missing, but the engine ran smoothly. Noah had replaced the leaking fuel seal, adjusted the brakes again, and cleaned the tank a second time. The tractor was not restored. It was dependable enough to work. Ruth sat beside him on the edge of the fender as they entered the Saturday livestock market. They had come to deliver hay to Earl and pick up mineral feed for the cattle. The sound of the old diesel drew attention before anyone recognized the machine. Farmers turned from the loading pens. A mechanic stepped out of the parts shop. Then someone pointed toward the hood. "That's the auction tractor." Within minutes, several people had gathered near the parking area. Clyde Benson came first. He walked around the machine slowly, checking the tires, engine, and rear hitch. "You got it moving," he said. Noah shut down the engine. "We got the hay in with it." Clyde looked toward the muddy mower marks still visible on the rear tires. "You rebuilt the engine?" "No." "New injection pump?" "No." Clyde frowned. "Then what was wrong?" "Dirty fuel, air in the lines, bad ground connections, blocked intake, stuck controls." Clyde stared at the engine. "Problems small enough to overlook. Together, large enough to make the tractor appear useless." More people arrived. Some had laughed during the auction. Others had watched silently, while Noah spent almost $400 on a machine no one believed would run. Now they stood close enough to feel the heat from its engine. Mason Briggs crossed the market yard from his dealership truck. He stopped when he saw the tractor. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he walked to the front, opened the hood without asking, and studied the engine. Noah let him look. Mason checked the new fuel line, the cleaned connections, and the repaired wiring. He placed one hand near the radiator, then inspected the exhaust. "You put a lot of time into it," he said. "Yes. And money. Less than another tractor." Mason closed the hood. "How does the transmission feel?" "Good enough. Hydraulics? Slow, but they hold." Mason stepped back and looked at the machine as a buyer now, not a critic. "I'll give you $1,800. The people nearby became quiet. Noah looked at him. "For the tractor?" Mason nodded. "Cash." At the auction, Mason had called it scrap. Now he was offering nearly 5 times what Noah had paid. Ruth watched her son without speaking. $1,800 could repair the barn roof. It could buy winter feed. It could replace broken fencing and cover several months of farm expenses. Noah looked at the tractor. The machine had already done what he needed most. It had saved the hay crop, but the Reed farm still needed a working tractor every week. Selling it would solve one problem and recreate another. "No," Noah said. Mason raised an eyebrow. $2,000. "No. You know I can find another one." "Then you should." A few men nearby smiled. Mason's expression hardened. "You think this is about proving me wrong?" Noah shook his head. "It's about having a tractor." Mason looked around at the crowd, then lowered his voice. "You were lucky." "Maybe." Noah placed one hand on the hood. "But luck didn't clean the fuel system." Mason had no answer. He stepped away from the tractor. Hal Turner, the auctioneer, had been standing near the livestock pens. He walked over carrying a paper cup of coffee. "I have to ask," he said. "How did you know?" Noah looked at the people around him. Some appeared curious. Others looked uncomfortable. They wanted a simple answer. A secret sign. A clever trick that had allowed a boy to see value where experienced men had seen waste. Noah could have told them about the rain cap, the dark fuel, the moving fan, and the corroded cables. Instead, he told them the truth. I didn't know. Hal frowned. You bid almost $400 without knowing? I knew the engine could turn. I knew the oil didn't show obvious water damage, and I knew no one had checked the fuel system properly. Noah looked toward Mason. That wasn't proof it would run. What was it then? Hal asked. A reason to keep looking. For a moment no one spoke. Then Earl arrived with his pickup and stopped beside the tractor. I heard somebody offered to buy it. 2,000, Ruth said. Earl whistled. You taking it? Noah already said no. Earl smiled. Good. I still need my hay moved. The tension broke. Several people laughed, but this time Noah was laughing with them. He climbed back into the seat. The starter turned strongly. The engine fired after 2 rotations and settled into a steady idle. No smoke, no hesitation, no silence. As Noah drove toward the feed store, the crowd stepped aside. The same men who had laughed at his bid now watched the tractor cross the market under its own power. Noah did not look back. He had not repaired the machine to embarrass them. He had repaired it because his family needed it. Their opinion had changed only after the engine started. His decision had been made while it was still silent. Winter arrived early that year. By the first week of December, snow covered the south field where Noah had cut the hay. The repaired barn roof still leaked in one corner, but the loft was full. The cattle had enough feed. The herd stayed together. Every morning, Noah started the blue tractor before sunrise. The engine still needed several seconds of preheating in the cold, but it no longer struggled. It pulled hay to the cattle, moved firewood, cleared snow from the lane, and carried fencing supplies across the farm. The machine was still far from perfect. The hydraulics moved slowly on cold mornings. The steering leaked a little oil. The left fender rattled whenever the engine reached higher speed. Noah repaired each problem as it appeared. He did not repaint the tractor. Ruth once asked why. You've fixed almost everything else, she said. Why leave it looking like that? Noah looked at the faded hood. Because the rust reminds me what everyone saw. And what did you see? Not enough to know the answer. He wiped grease from his hands. Just enough to ask another question. Inside the barn, Noah had kept the cardboard sign from the auction. Does not run. Sold as is. He hung it above the workbench beside his grandfather's notebook. The sign no longer described the tractor. It described the moment when everyone had stopped looking. Mason Briggs never apologized. But several farmers began bringing Noah small repair jobs. A starter that turned too slowly, a mower that lost power under load, an old generator that had been left in a shed for years. Noah never promised he could fix them. He inspected each machine before offering an opinion. Sometimes the problem was simple. Sometimes the damage was too severe. The lesson was not that every broken machine could be saved. It was that a diagnosis required more than silence. One cold afternoon, Walter Hale returned to the farm. He stood beside the blue tractor while it idled near the barn. Ben would have liked to hear that sound again, he said. Noah looked at the exhaust rising into the winter air. Did he ever think about selling it? Many times. Why didn't he? Walter smiled. He said old machines tell you what they need, but only after you stop being angry long enough to listen. Noah thought about the auction yard, the laughter, the warnings. The moment the gavel fell, he had believed he was buying a tractor. In truth, he had bought a question no one else wanted to answer. Why had the machine stopped? The answer had not been one dramatic failure. It had been many small ones. Dirty fuel, a blocked vent, air in the lines, weak electrical connections, a clogged intake, stiff controls. Neglect had made the tractor look dead. Patience had revealed that it was not. Near sunset, Noah loaded hay onto the rear carrier and drove toward the cattle pasture. The old diesel crossed the snow-covered yard with a steady rhythm. Ruth watched from the barn door. The tractor had saved the harvest. The harvest had saved the herd. And the herd had kept the farm alive for another year. Noah had not become rich. He had not defeated the town. He had simply protected what his family was close to losing. At the auction, the crowd had laughed because the tractor was silent. But silence had never been proof that the machine was finished. It only meant no one had yet found the reason it could not speak. Now the engine's roar carried across the frozen fields, and every time Noah heard it, he remembered the truth hidden beneath the rust. Being neglected was not the same as being worthless.